Good evening and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark. In case you're new here, this is a radio show and podcast that likes to dive deep into the shadows of Saskatchewan's past to learn what lies within. Sometimes we even go to other locations across Canada to talk dark history, mysteries, urban legends, and sometimes even monsters. I'm your host, K.D. Kulpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher here in Regina, Saskatchewan. I love digging into the past to bring life to the ghosts and monsters hiding in the dark. And I especially love going live every week with you to tell you what I've uncovered. We are returning to the local Saskatchewan haunt series of the show tonight, and I thought it might be fun to talk about one of the more famous local ghosts instead of just a single building. If you've ever looked into ghost stories of Regina, you'll likely have heard of him. So step back in time with me as we discuss the stories and history behind one of Regina's most famous ghosts, Francis Nicholson Darke. As I said, you may have heard of the ghost that we're going to be talking about tonight if you have ever looked into who is known to be haunting the buildings of Regina. There is one location in particular that is fairly well known to be haunted by him. However, as I dug into his history and started to hear about ghost stories from other buildings, it seems that maybe he could be moving around. Apparently, Mr. Darke has been roaming around Regina for years after his passing, so you never know where he might pop up to say hello. But first, you might be wondering, who is Francis Darke, and why might he be haunting so many Regina locations? Let's dive into the life of Francis Darke before we talk about the places you might find him roaming. First, Darke was born near Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in October of 1863. He grew up on a family farm, but eventually he moved to Western Canada in his late 20s to try business for himself. Apparently, he had taken a trip through the prairies in 1891 during a particularly good year for crops and decided that the prairies were the place to be. I guess he went even beyond Regina. It sounds like, according to different newspaper articles that I found, that he went to Calgary, Red Deer area, kind of a little bit of everywhere. And remember, back then it wasn't Saskatchewan yet, so this would have been I think they called it the northwest portion of Canada, right? So it wasn't Saskatchewan and Alberta yet, but he was checking out the towns and cities around here. Now, he did return to Prince Edward Island after his little tour of the prairies and ended up marrying Elizabeth Ann McKinnon while there in 1892. Now, shortly after this marriage, I guess they decided that, they are going to move to Regina to buy a farm with a partner. And this partner, I can't remember his name, but he also came from Prince Edward Island. And they were going to get into the farming business in the prairies. Now, originally, they had livestock, but as well as, I believe, crops. But later, after having a particularly difficult year in farming in their very first year, unfortunately, that prosperous 1891 didn't continue, which we all know too well, living and growing up in Saskatchewan. So they decided that they better purchase a butcher shop on Scarth Street to expand their business even further and, bring in a little bit extra money on the side. So according to an article in the Regina Leader Post from 2011, like I said, Francis Darke has been in the newspapers and on people's minds for a long time after his passing. Their butcher business became so profitable that Darke actually eventually bought out his business partner and decided to start a bigger butcher shop that was just up the street, so up Scarth Street. Eventually, he even became involved in cattle exporting and then later real estate. So like I said, he wanted to get into business here in Regina, and so he was buying into everything. Now in 1906, he did end up leaving the cattle industry completely. I guess he decided that real estate was going so well for him that that's where his focus was going to be moving forward. And he became even more involved in the Regina community as part of that process. I mean, even before that, so in 1897 and 1898, he actually even became Regina's mayor. And to this day, he holds the record as Regina's youngest mayor because he was 35 years old when he took on that role. So in 1925 then, Darke was even elected to the House of Commons of Canada as a Liberal MP for Regina. So I guess he decided to add in, politics into his career as well. And that wasn't all that Francis Darke was involved in within Regina city limits. He was also the reason for the Darke Block building, and that was at 21, the building's still there, 2125 11th Avenue in downtown Regina. So if you ever go down 11th Avenue off of, I forget what it's off the top of my head, but anyway, if you go down 11th Avenue and you see 2125, that actually was built for Francis Darke. This 5-story building was constructed in 1907 and was designed by Darling and Pearson. And it actually became a heritage building in 1989, which is why we still see it standing there probably. According to the Leader Post editorials, in July of 1940, he had actually bought more land in the area than he needed for the building. So eventually he chose to sell a portion of that to the Masonic order before building his office building. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit of information as well. So beyond being the youngest mayor in Regina and still holding that title to this day, Darke is also well known for his donations to the growing community of Regina. And you've probably seen the name Darke, so Darke, splattered all around Regina, because I think he has some streets named after him as well. In 1910, he both donated and helped raise the funds required to establish the Regina College, which we now know as the College Avenue campus as part of the University of Regina. In between 1928 and 1929, he also donated money to building the Darke Hall, which was then known as the Darke Music and Arts Hall. It ended up being built right beside the original campus of Regina College, which, funny enough, we just talked about in a previous episode where we actually went there and got to talk ghosts and history, so that was a lot of fun. So yeah, Francis Darke was involved in making sure that building was created, as well as the Darke Hall beside it. Now, he was also in Regina during the 1912 tornado, of course, that devastated a big portion of, what was then a small city of Regina. And unfortunately for him and his family at that time, their home was actually near the path of the tornado. It was, right across from Victoria Park, where if you have listened to previous episodes, we talked about the tornado and how Frank and Bertha Blankhorn unfortunately were walking in the park when it did hit, and unfortunately lost their lives even after surviving, or not surviving, I guess, but they missed the trip on Titanic only to get to Regina to be killed by a tornado in the park. Now, so Darke actually lived across the street, and instead of fixing their home, Darke's wife apparently insisted on building a new house made of the same material as the legislative building, because the legislative building at the time, even though the tornado went near it, it had minimum damage from the tornado, so it didn't get completely destroyed. So Darke decided to build, a home for his wife so that she could feel safer in that same material. So what you might not know is that Darke built the house now known as the Stone Hall Castle that's directly across from Darke Hall, And so he built that in 1926. Now, there have been rumors that tunnels were also built between Darke Hall and Darke's home, but as far as I know, there's no evidence that has been found recently to prove of their existence. I don't know, who has tried to look into this. I haven't personally, but apparently during renovations, it said that these things have not been found. But because of his new home, this meant that he no longer needed his old land. So he ended up selling his old house and land to the Canadian Pacific Railway at that time so that they could build the Hotel Saskatchewan on that exact location. Obviously, there would have been multiple houses that had to be, bought up because the Hotel Saskatchewan is quite large. But yeah, originally that was residential, a little section of residential area. So that's what was there before the Hotel Saskatchewan was built. And another connection to Francis Darke is actually within the walls of the Metropolitan Methodist Church, which is now known as the Knox Metropolitan Church. Again, kind of in that same area. And that is the Darke Memorial Chimes were given to the church in 1927 in the memory of their son Clifford. So their son Clifford unfortunately died in 1926 after flipping his car on Broad Street and suffering a fractured skull. I had read the original newspaper article about this particular accident, and it sounds like Clifford had the worst injuries. There were other people in the vehicle, but they managed to survive, and it was just Clifford. He somehow managed to fracture his skull. In fact, I think the other ones didn't have seatbelts, and so they actually were flung from the vehicle, whereas Clifford was trapped within the vehicle, and unfortunately, he didn't survive his injuries. Now, on July 16th of 1940, Francis Darke suffered a heart attack at 76 years old. So he lived to 76 in Regina here. So spent, nearly 50 years in Regina and helping build the community. And although it was reported that they thought he was healing after this heart attack, he did pass away on July 17th. And apparently he had been suffering from stomach problems for 10 days prior to that attack. So, or so the newspapers say anyway. I found a clipping that is from July 17th or July 18th, I think it was, from the Leader Post that talked about him passing and that he had been dealing with stomach problems for at least 10 days before this attack happened. And funny enough, his funeral was actually held within the Darke Hall before his body was placed in the family mausoleum in the Regina Cemetery. So, as you can see, in life, Francis, or Frank, as he was later referred to in the paper, so I can only assume that was his preference to be called, had a big impact on the Regina community when he decided to move here. So I suppose that given his passion for the area, it shouldn't be surprising that people say they still see Frank around the city, periodically popping up in buildings he used to frequent when he was alive. In fact, before we jump into the actual ghost sightings, in case you missed my YQR Haunts guide, which is a free guide that you can get on my website that lists my favorite ghosts and haunted buildings of Regina, I thought I'd share one more time that the Darke name came up in the newspaper for something, a little eerie, a little weird, a little unusual, even after, 1940. So the Darke Mausoleum is the only one in the Regina Cemetery, if you haven't been there, so it obviously stands out. Unfortunately, this does mean that the Darke family is prone to vandals in their resting place. At one point, sometime in the 1980s, what is thought to be bones from one of the bodies was actually even stolen from the mausoleum. Now, the news article I'm referring to that kind of talks about this occurrence is from November 14th, 1988. I believe I talked about it in the previous episode when we talked about the YQR Haunts Guide, but just in case you missed it, this was an article written in the Leader Post about an incident that occurred on the Friday before. So the article stated that a small inscribed metal box, a knife, and bones at the doorway to the Darke family mausoleum were discovered by a headstone designer. The headstone designer was in the cemetery to, I guess, survey damage caused by headstone vandalism, where he came across the box. So unfortunately, because of the location of Regina Cemetery and because, they can only do so much to fence it off and lock things, vandalism is a quite common thing in the area, unfortunately. So it's not surprising. They weren't surprised to find that, someone had been there and, tried to break into the mausoleum again, even though they constantly were replacing the locks. Anyway, the box had the inscription, Darke Clarence Thomas, 1899 to 1966 on it. And I guess it was like they broke in and they left it like on top of one of the coffins or above one of the coffins or something. So eventually somebody was caught for, having done this. But it's still unfortunate that, the Darke name continues to appear in the newspapers, even from the cemetery. Okay, let's get into some of the ghost sightings. So the most well-known sightings of Francis Darke happen within the music hall. So, as I said, Darke Hall, which he loves so much. Apparently, he was known for frequenting the hall quite a bit when the Regina Symphony Orchestra used the space. The ghost story claims that he still visits during rehearsals. Now, I don't know how often Regina Symphony Orchestra actually use the space now. I think they've changed it and it's more for other kinds of events, from what I can see when I get the little pamphlet in the mail. But the story goes that during rehearsals, it isn't unusual to see a man dressed in older period clothing sitting in the audience and watching the show. Some have even said that the seat, moves. So I guess I don't know if they're still the same seats nowadays. They may have changed them because I know they went through a big renovation recently. But apparently previously they had those seats, that you push down the seat when you want to sit down on it. And when you get up, the hinge springs up. There's like a spring that springs it up. Well, it is said that his favorite seat has been seen to move down by itself during rehearsals. So that's why they figure, it's Frank coming back to watch rehearsal while they're there. And other stories of the building claim that you can sometimes hear footsteps pacing on the stage. Although it hasn't been said if those are expected to also be Francis Darke, but it is just another ghost story that I've heard. And no one has ever seen him actually walking on the stage that I'm made aware of anyways. So it's hard to say who it might be, but there is that. And then another kind of story from the area is that a man in early 20th century clothing has been said to be seen walking the halls of Darke Hall as well. So just checking in on the building, I guess, to make sure the one that he built and, got named after himself and that he loves so much is being taken care of. And these stories have actually been featured in, I guess, Haunted Canada books and Creepy Canada. I think I've looked up the Creepy Canada episode. I don't think I've seen the Haunted Canada books, but like I said, it's a pretty well-known story that Francis Darke still wanders Darke Hall every chance he gets. Now, another building that is said to be haunted, although it's not clear by who from what I can tell, is the Hotel Saskatchewan. And I'm hoping one of these days I'll get to do a feature on Hotel Saskatchewan in the future, so cross fingers for me that eventually that happens. But given that Darke used to live there, it does make me wonder if some of the ghost sightings in the hotel could have been the Regina businessman again. I know of one account where someone told me about a ghost that they saw in the building, and it was in the basement where there's now a gym, I guess. And they, didn't really pay much attention, but they just saw someone come in and walk by. But all they saw was the, kind of from knees down. And they could see that this person was wearing like slacks with those white and black spectator shoes, if you remember them. They were quite popular back in the 20s and 30s. And, Darke would have been a prominent businessman still. Like, he'd be in his 60s and 70s by then. But, like, he'd still be pretty prominent businessman and probably had some nice stuff. So it kind of makes you wonder if Darke still visits the hotel where his home used to be built. Especially since it was in the basement. It does kind of make you wonder. I have yet to talk to anyone who's actually been within the Darke Block building. Like I said, that's on 11th Avenue. I would love to connect with anyone that who's been in the building or knows someone that's been in the building, as I wonder if Francis Darke has also visited its halls. Because again, his office was in the Darke Block building, and he had it built himself so that he could hold his real estate dealings and stuff like that out of it. According to the 1909 Henderson's Regina directory, which I was able to find online, it's hard to say. So in 1909, his office was in room 101. Then in 1913, it said his office was in room 301. And then in 1931, it says his office was in 201. So it seems he liked to move around anytime, somebody left the building, I guess. So he wasn't happy with staying in the same office all the time. I'm not sure. But if you know anyone who might have had experiences of Francis Darke in the Darke Block, which again is 2125 11th Avenue in downtown Regina, please ask them to let me know, because I would love to talk to somebody about that building. In fact, I'd love to actually go into the building and see what it's like nowadays. I don't know if they've had heavy renovations, but I'm assuming they have. But it would still be interesting to go, check out 201 and 301 and 101. Go check out all the first rooms on each floor to see if we can find Francis. But anyway, because he does seem to be a ghost who likes to wander the city, revisiting his favorite places. So maybe he also shows up there, because he probably spent a lot of time in those offices. And there you have it. Some of my favorite ghost stories about Regina's Francis Darke. I absolutely love hearing about any other history about him. He just seems like quite the character, and so I love doing research into him and talking about him. So if you or anyone you know has any more stories or ghost appearances about Francis, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to do more radio shows about him. Or if you know anyone who has been in the Darke Block building that has a story, I'd love to hear that as well. Maybe I could do, a whole show just about the Darke Block. That would be kind of fun. If you'd like me to investigate the history of another prominent Saskatchewan person who is suspected of haunting a location in Saskatchewan, please contact me. I have a form on my website, so that's kdkulpa.com. So head on over there and fill it out. I'm always looking for new stories, ideas for new buildings, and anything in between. Thank you for joining us tonight. Did you know I also have a weekly newsletter? And this includes a link to the latest episode of ParaGhoul Paranormal. Because after every radio show airs, I take the recording and I put it up onto my podcast platform, which goes onto Apple, Spotify, all the things. And within my newsletter, you get a link to that podcast. So subscribers also receive updates about upcoming events, behind the scenes information, and subscriber only updates related to upcoming book releases, book signings, and more. If you're interested, make sure you head over to my website. Again, kdkulpa.com to sign up. And if you'd like to support the show and the potential on-location adventures we're hoping to continue doing after we went to the college campus, which was a lot of fun, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. And I also have a Patreon for those that want behind-the-scenes information, extra content, and a chance to join a live Q&A with me each month. I've also started uploading anytime I do video recordings of the interviews, because sometimes, we go long and we have to cut out some of the interview. So if you want to see the videos of the interviews, the full-length videos, then they are also now on my Patreon. Next week, we are supposed to be diving back into the history of the paranormal industry. But I thought it might be fun to do something a little different. And instead of talking about paranormal devices and, the history of them and the science behind them, I thought it would be interesting to instead tackle a historical mystery. So I'm digging up some information about a Canadian mystery that included the use of paranormal devices and mediums to try to solve the case. I think we've talked about it before on here. where they tried to use mediums and things in previous true crime investigations. So I thought we'd talk about one of those. So we will be talking about the Ambrose Small disappearance. So make sure you tune in next week to learn more about that. So stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is KD Kulpa signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.